Nancy, go ahead. All right, good afternoon, everyone. It is Tuesday, August 22, 2023, and this is a policy committee meeting of the West Bend Joint School District Number 1. I hereby call this meeting to order. We have here board members John Donaldson, I'm Chris Swigert, Dr. Chad Temez, also board member, and then Superintendent Wimmer. With those introductions, our next item on our agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you, everyone. Superintendent Wimmer, I will turn over to you for our first discussion item, which is policy cycle for review.
So we were talking prior, we're kind of finishing up the last of the 800 and 900 series. We've got a bucket of some leftovers. We delved a little bit into 300s. You'll see kind of a mix of some numbers here before we set that cycle for review. I wanted to check in with board before I kind of set that in stone. The 29th, we had a few that we held over for legal consult, some pieces of that nature, but I would like to proceed with the 300 series that we have that would go before the board for a third reading. We talked about, are they perfect? No. Are we still continuing to do some work on the back end? Yes, but I think it's important for us to solidify that first step forward, and then I can weave in some of the feedback we've gotten, some of the things that we propose into our work session that's coming up in September. So I just wanted to get policy committee feelings from that, knowing that, again, we're pretty clear that work isn't done, but at least we're moving it forward. Any thoughts or feelings on getting that slate for the third review and then bringing it right back to work session and back to committee again?
I think that the idea of bringing it forward to the board for third reading is consistent with what we discussed at the last board meeting, and the idea that, like you had said, these items aren't perfect, but advances the ball down the field. We're taking more of an iterative approach to this. And so I think that's consistent. Certainly, I look forward to the feedback of the other committee members here, but I'd be fine with that. And I appreciate the fact that what you're doing really is dealing with, okay, what are the leftovers, right? We have some important items there. John?
Yeah, and I agree. I think, like you said, we're taking an iterative approach to this, and I think the biggest next step is just to know when we're bringing it back to us
Correct.
the next step for the next update. So.
Yeah, we're certainly not done. It won't be shelved. I think our board understands that and really make sure the community understands that. You'll see it right again as part of our work at our work session in September and right back in committee, so.
Well, not to put too much pressure on that whole work session idea, but I think this is just my perspective. The work and discussion that we're going to have at that work session, I think, is going to actually help guide us as to the policy wording, because otherwise we're going to try to come up with policy wording in advance of having that guidance.
Right.
So it's kind of in a bit of a cycle and in a bit of a loop, but I think that's an appropriate way to proceed.
Perfect. Chad, any thoughts around us bringing that last we did some revisions, getting those approved at least by the board as a platform, and then we continue to the work?
No, I'm comfortable moving forward with all that.
Okay, great.
I don't have any concerns about continuing to work on it.
Perfect. And then that puts us, so I'll get those on the Monday agenda. 29th is again policy. We've got the last of our bucket. We had sent off quite a few for legal review and some other pieces. We'll clean that up and then we'll start advancing. We'll do that 300 series work that we're already engaged in at committee in September, and then push in another date, probably get that cleaned up, and then we can start our every other month for their formal cycle.
All right.
Okay. I will mock that up as a calendar for us to look at then for the year.
Thank you. Which then takes us to annual notices.
So you can appreciate that there's and I brought it, a 19-page guidance document on annual notices for families. So this is from WASB. Recall that they're our policy support provider. And we cleaned up our website, so I'd ask you to click on the annual notices. So there's 19 pages, but there's not 19 exact notices or policies per se. There's a mix of annual information that you provide to your families, your community, and sometimes you send direct pieces. So an example of a direct piece would be, I on the website have information about human growth and development, But I also, in advance of those lessons, send you direct notification if your child is impacted, those kinds of things. So you don't see those here. You also don't see, there's certain things around your rights as a parent that go into the family handbook, and you've just approved that. So that has, in attention to it, a bunch of policies and notices around like free and reduced lunch and those pieces. Those are in the family handbook. And then this is the slate that goes kind of just an annual general notice. So we'll advise that these have been updated to our families and here's where they sit. So I'll just give you kind of an overview of them, and if you want to click on them if you've got any questions, we'll publish this for our families. It's certainly out and live and they're updated, but if you have any questions or from your different perspectives think something could be worded a little bit better, we can get that in before we send out notice to our families that they've been updated. So the first is an annual asbestos notification. So you have to declare what was worked on in your buildings in compliance with that. So EMC, Environmental Management Consultants, is our contracted partner, as well as some staff in buildings and grounds who oversee the asbestos plan, but we have a disclosure annually around what was worked on and what they had, and if anyone has any concerns or questions regarding that plan, who they would get in touch with. And that's just a general notification for asbestos annually. The annual notice of academic standards. So some of these you will recall at your first board meeting of the year, you formally approved this notice. It goes out to families directly. It went out into our Wednesday mailing. They've already been advised. So sometimes they're corresponding to action. So you took action on that. Education for employment, it's just talking about our academic and career planning and some of the workforce and economic development. The College and Career Center will have some updates for that, but nothing right now that would stand in the way or be in conflict with this notice per se. And then looking at local public offices, recall that we talk about records and who's a local officer and is it elected or are they not, but so that's just updating that list. And when we name the new Badger principal, we're finalizing those pieces now. We will update that list on there. Educational options, we send that out. That's generally every January. That comes before the board as well. We just talk about what are all the options, how are our schools performing, what are all your options that you have in a district. Sometimes especially families who might be shopping to come to us through open enrollment might be looking at some of the things that we offer and provide through that notice. The general non-discrimination statement. Student assessment, recall you approved the assessment calendar. There's a wealth of information for families, but we also provide a general notice around assessment and the different types of assessment. Title I program, again, you have policy on Title I. This is a notification that some of our schools are Title I schools and what that does and doesn't mean. Title IX, non-discrimination, they are going to be doing some updates to Title IX. They anticipate that they'll be rolled forward in October. We don't see any implications for policy or this notice, but we might be updating. There's a link to training materials that we currently utilize. It's most likely going to be updated training materials. So when that happens, I'll just do a board update and let you know and update it automatically. And then on the student services side, the dyslexia and related conditions, that's a guidebook that the Department of Public Instruction put out, and there's a certain act that requires you to make that accessible to families. So we'll have this actually here, and then as student services look at their website, the components of their, they might nest it in there as well, just so it makes sense where families might be looking for information. It would be not just in the compliance section, but also there. Homeless Children's Services, so that's just notifying who our direct contact is. That's Jill Corbett. She serves in that role for our district as the homeless liaison to the state and other districts. So another district might come here and look, they've got a family in transition and they might need to coordinate with us as a new district, you know, something of that nature. They can see that it's Jill Corbett. I might have a family like, hey, we're doubled up for a while, do we qualify for this? They know who the contact is. They certainly, anyone who reaches out to us to enroll, our registrar is well versed in that. in kind of getting at those things and connecting, but this is just that external piece around what that looks like. Again, you have policy that supports this practice. Child Find is just some of the activities and obligations if you think that a student might be a child with a disability, and it's members in our community, maybe daycare providers, pediatricians that kids see, and some of the pieces that we do to reach out in the community and ensure that children who may have a specific need or could benefit from maybe some further assessment to determine that. It's ensuring, because we would start services right before a child's third birthday, we would do an evaluation, and at their third birthday, they're eligible for services. So recall that we would serve in a public setting ages 3 through 21 if specific disabilities exist that would qualify students for those services. So these are those concentrated efforts to get out before school age to support that.
I'm just curious, so for a 3-year-old, can you just describe what does that entail? I'm just curious.
Sure, so sometimes there's some really early speech pieces, maybe a delay in speech, all of that. There may be other medical, physical conditions that are requiring additional physical therapy, occupational therapy, some readiness pieces. So what's great is we run our own Head Start. So families in our district as well as the surrounding area are well versed in connecting with us as an agency, and that helps us get them connected with student services, not only in our district, but also maybe their resident district, because recall we serve Head Start for the county too. So, and we would always encourage, you know, if anyone has those delays, they're generally talking about them with their family physician, pediatrician, and they might also say, oh, you might want to connect with the school, that kind of thing too. Special education, confidentiality, and referral. So that is just if you have a child who has a suspected disability, who to connect with if you need to make a referral or talk that through. Again, people are generally just giving us a call and we're routing them to the correct spot in student services to help you get that started. And then it's just talking about the information gathered through that process and its confidentiality. Many of these pieces also are not just annual notices for our public or our families, but there's a lot of annual notices associated with our own staff. So the piece around having a student with a suspected disability and their obligation to refer or get connected, even as a staff member working with the child. So there's other additional pieces. We do an online training portal for staff, and it allows us to deploy kind of who needs what training annually to participate in that supports these annual notices. Any questions around kind of the different routes we take to make sure that we're meeting the compliance pieces for annual notices for staff and families?
You started out by discussing the fact that we partner with WASB. Can you just remind us again? I'm assuming they'll let us know if a new notice is required, if language to an existing notice is required.
Correct. So each spring they'll put out, like I said, it's 19 pages of, hey, these are the ones, and we're going through and checking and plotting the route, this one in the handbook, this one here, this one to the board, to ensure that we have that. And then they have periodic publications or alerts. That's why I know in their last alert they were saying, we think Title IX is going to come out in October, it could update the training materials, here's how you need to respond. So they really help as that external monitoring for us as things advance either in the state or federally, and the implications locally for our own policies or practice. So it's a really helpful tool.
So when something like that happens, that the required language changes, maybe there's a federal mandate or a state mandate, remind me, this does or does not need to come in front of the board in that it's a required mandated language. What's our
It
practice?
does and doesn't.
Yeah.
So it depends. If I have current policy language that's in conflict, then I would bring that forward in that manner so that we're attending to it through policy. We usually have a little bit of leeway knowing something's coming, when is it going to be, and if they put that in, it's not like, oh, and it's in place by tomorrow. It's you have until such and such to get that up to speed. So we monitor. So it really depends. Or it could be, so let's say the Title IX trainings fundamentally shift. I might advise you as the board in an update saying X, Y, and Z have changed. We've reviewed it, there's no implications for our policy. You won't see it come forward as an action item, but it might just be an awareness item
Sure.
for you. So it could be several different pieces there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any questions around annual notices or?
Any questions? All right.
And they
We
have-
move then to.
Yeah, they have loosened, just so you're aware, they have loosened up some of the statutes. Some are required to go in the newspaper, some are required for the website, some are required directly to families. So we monitor that, which ones would qualify and make sure. So there's still a couple notices that we're having to push in the paper. So some of your pieces around your annual meeting and publishing your budget, those are still going to be notices that aren't just nested in your website. They're going in the paper as well.
Sure.
So we take care of that when those come into play.
Very good. All right. Next on our agenda then is policy 161, board member authority. And I think you noted this was discussed in the past, and we wanted to delve into this in greater detail, correct?
Yes, the piece that we wanted to delve into, there was a competing piece in the 800 series around board member visits. We struck that language and moved that forward. Board visits are connected into this policy. So we said we just wanted to look at that piece again. You can see it, there was no need to have it jointly stated. It was in the 800 and something or the other related to visits.
So the point is it's covered here.
Right, that's why we were comfortable there, but we did talk about, there was question about board member visits. Many board members wear a parent hat too. So they're in schools for a variety of reasons. But you know, when it's board business, it's a little bit different. Those are scheduled, those are sanctioned by the board, those are those pieces. So it's just understanding that board members wear multiple hats. So they could be there for a concert, a play, and then also you'll see sometimes we know and understand you have roles sometimes as parents plus board members, but anytime I think that there's a quorum of board members going to be present at an event, we will notice it. So the Holiday Pops concert is sometimes a big one. You know, I might have a quorum there, and I notice that. Whether or not you're there in that capacity, we don't want anyone to misconstrue that. And we just notice like, hey, our board might all be present here, and you know, no board business is taking place. That's not to say meetings of chance can't happen, but this was specific to board members visiting schools.
What questions do we have? Any additional questions we want to explore here? All right. Well, hearing none.
Yep, no recommendations for change.
Okay.
185, again, when we went into the 800 series, we removed a section. I've placed it into, in here it was from 880, it was around citizens advisory committees. So I brought that language around board committees, because if we had a citizens advisory committee in some capacity, it would be sanctioned by the board and go through this. So I'm just putting that language right here in context for you to see if you'd like it pushed in here, if you want to sunset that language. We just felt when we were reviewing the 800s, it felt more like it belonged with committees. So bringing that back for the board to review.
I think it seems appropriate to have it in this section.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it fits, and I don't have any problems with the wording of the language.
Us neither. We don't have any concerns per se. Every committee that we convene, whether it's human growth and development, whether it would be something like the reconsideration committee, those are guided further by policies or other pieces. So this is just saying some committees may exist at the discretion and authority of the board.
Just on the last revised date,
Mm-hmm.
you might want to update that to a real date.
For, oh yeah, the 2101, that didn't
Yeah.
exist.
Oh.
You know, I'm gonna start just putting in an Easter egg every time. Now we'll see if it gets, John gets a gold star today.
Yeah, there's one Easter egg in
I'll
every
make sure.
policy.
Yeah, I'll
That's
make
good
sure
catch.
that that's updated.
Yeah, I agree. I think that this fits well here, and it
Mhm.
squarely fits the title of board committees. You know, I think.
Are you okay with placement following the other standing committees, citizen committees, and then work sessions? I think it fit there, but that was something I just kind of placed.
Makes sense.
Okay. Great, then I'll bring that revision forward
Where,
with a real date.
where is the information housed that declares how they would, call upon a citizen advisory committee? How would something like that be selected?
So it depends, it'd be in our policy or statute. Human growth and development is guided by state statute. And then what we've been grappling with lately is our reconsideration committee and how that was made up, and that was dictated by policy. We hadn't had to convene one of those in a decade, so.
So those individual pieces would be identified
Yep.
at the individual policy that they're needed for?
Yeah, or annually, so good points as well. So each spring, when we are getting ready to onboard new members, remember one of the first meetings, Chad, that you sat through was, these are all the committees, these are all the positions, this is this. Are there any other committees we'd like to look at? Is this how we want to approach things? That's a board discussion at that time. And then we would have those committees put in place for that year forthcoming to go through that. So there's a couple different avenues that really oversee and guide that process too.
Any other questions on board committees, 185? All right, hearing none, let's move to policy 751, transportation services management.
So we talked about that a little bit at a board meeting. We didn't feel the need or impetus to do anything to change that policy language going into this school year. We didn't want to disrupt, but we did talk about making a change for future forward. I do have some of those numbers kind of nested in the previous information, and then one of the questions that I did ask, and I don't have the data for yet, is what would it look like if grades 5 through 12 went to the 1.99 miles, to see if that savings was worth that. But again, we just looked at standardizing, looking at aligning the K4 to the 1.25 miles versus you've got a mix right now.
That's what I was gonna say with that. And so this is not, this is current information.
So, yep, if you.
But we had talked about making K through 4 the same, whatever number it is, but the same.
Right, and leaving that a
Because
little
it'd be
bit
at the same
lower.
school.
I think there was discussion at the board level, and I think that there was, at least my perception, no need to rip that Band-Aid off and, oh my goodness, hit everyone 1.99 miles just because we can. I did not get that sense of direction from the board at all, but that kind of standardizing and easing into it. What we did find is it's interesting, I forget the name of the complex. If you go to kind of standardize, I'll have to get the name from Nate is my liaison. There was one apartment complex where like one part would fall under one part of it, but not the other. So I want to talk through some of those pieces. So what you can do is you can have everyone from that complex walk to the nearest stop and consider them eligible as the complex primary address, and then they come to that stop. Because I don't think it makes sense to have one part of a community like that. That's like me going in a subdivision and saying, you two are neighbors, and I'm gonna take you, but not you. That just feels arbitrary and unusual. So then I'll have him look at and assess and say, okay, I'm gonna declare this address of the complex primary address eligible. You can come anywhere in these boundaries to grab that stop. It wouldn't be a hardship. They wouldn't be walking miles. It would just be a little bit, I wouldn't be going through.
Well, so I mean, just to be clear on that, I mean, we're talking about the same complex or the same condo association or something like
Same.
that. But not, I mean, you have to draw a line somewhere at the
Correct.
address. So at some point, someone is gonna be literally across the street from not being able to
Sure.
get on the bus. But if it's the same complex, then it would make any part of that address
Right.
that's within distance would include, I would assume, all of the address.
And what we did
That
this
would-
year
that would
too,
make
and
sense.
that's why we were under no rush to deal with it kind of policy-wise, because administratively, when we looked at it, we could have allowed everyone, if we reset the boundary, they could all get on at a near stop and have accessible transportation and do that. And if we were gonna make a change this year, we said we wouldn't want to sanction them by having them do pay to ride this year, but it sets us up for next year. So what I can do is actually have them go forward with those maps of what transportation would look like, what the numbers of implications would be. You've had some soft numbers here kind of coming into this year, and then we talked about that survey data, in talking with families around what would that mean for your family, do you have concerns about that, kind of before we formalize that. But if you're okay with still us having access to pay to ride to nearest stops, and then, like I said, kind of complexes, you know, making, like you said, having a real line, but then getting them to the right side of the line, so to speak, I think that's the best route.
Yeah, I think the sense that I had gotten from the board meeting is general support for this idea, just more so an understanding of, we just want to be sure we're not unwittingly creating some massive chaos, which I don't think we expect.
And I'll have them run, I'll have them run the numbers anyway, but I didn't get the sense of direction for me to, like I said, take the bar to 1.99 for everyone in any form or fashion on that. It was really to go with what we were proposing, that alignment at 1.25 miles, and then figuring out some of those nuances, and then creating the structures for pay to ride options. Because for some families that may make sense, right? Maybe, they've got a babysitter here or there and it's a little different, and what we can do. We've always been able to kind of navigate those situations. We do have right now one area that's under study with the Sheriff's Department for consideration for a hazardous transportation. And that was sparked, a parent had contacted us. We've been working with a pay to ride option for them. They just feel where they're at would be a dangerous crossing, but it will take months for the Sheriff's Department. They have to declare that to go through and do that. So in the interim, we just talked about, like, oh, here's some options. And they found an option that works for them and created comfort for them too,
So this has nothing to do with the new software that we're supposed to be getting some numbers for, correct?
Nope, they're separate softwares.
Okay.
This would be Versatrans, Go Right Way
I
utilizes that.
And I guess I just assumed that with that software, we would utilize that and, in tandem, create a, whatever distances are gonna be better for cost efficiencies and,
You will.
routes like that. So I feel like I don't even know why we're doing this right now
Mhm.
until we have that data and
So
we have the full
Do
scope
you
of the-
want this to come after kind of the picture of taking the schools on and offline and where you can redraw the boundaries?
I mean, what would be the effect on that starting the school year in 2 weeks?
We're not doing
This
anything
isn't-
for an effect, so as you said, we can bring that alongside it and bring transportation implications. So you're gonna have those two systems talk to each other for that point. Here's the issue with our geographic area that predates everyone. So in a district, you generally would place your schools kind of all over geographically and draw a radius around. Ours are almost spokes of a wheel. They're all, and they come out as a pie. So it's very hard to get some of that yield. But yeah, what we can do, John, as a piece of that pie is when we look at each one, do a separate transportation finding and bake it into that. And if it leads you to believe, different pieces around that, we can bring that forward. Again, there's no rush. It's just kind of what information to make this readiness, because you would want to have any changes to this done by spring so that you're forecasting for families.
Yeah, so this is
Like a spring
not,
break.
we're not having any changes this year.
Nope.
This is the future thing. So I guess I would just like all the information before, I don't know if it's useful or
Sure.
efficient to do it twice when we don't have everything.
No, I can do that as part of that report and make it twofold. The attendance area and boundaries, and then transportation plans that go with. Nate and I have been talking about that. He knows that's coming, so that works for us too.
In the last paragraph here, in working with Go Right Way,
Mm-hmm.
just so I have clarity on the numbers here, for example, number 2, you're saying if the distance were increased by that quarter mile, that affects 58 people, but
Mhm.
of those 58, only 37 were used. So there would be
Correct.
37 people who were getting bused who would now have to walk.
Sure, or find an alternate.
Or find an alternative, but
Mhm.
that's what I'm reading, I just want to make sure I'm reading that
Correct,
correctly.
you are correct.
Okay. And in increasing, or or if we move them.
Decrease it to
1.75,
make more eligible.
Then 55
Mhm.
more people would have to, okay,
Correct.
I got you. I just wanted to.
And there's just costs associated with taking it the other way.
Yep, that's fine. That's the only question I
Perfect.
So it sounds like perhaps,
Think about that a little bit more, and when we bring that back, then we'll just make the transportation plan go with it. We've made a commitment to kind of bring every school offline, what new attendance boundaries would or wouldn't look like, as we kind of analyze that alongside the facilities reports. And again, our target is November for that piece.
okay. And you were saying that a decision on this
It
by
could go-
spring would be appropriate, so the
Right,
November timeframe
you want it on the
should be-
radar, yep, that March,
Compatible.
April, you really want that by then, to give people time to plan.
So bringing this together with between the transportation and the attendance boundaries is complementary, we can do that.
It's complementary, but you may find, because you may or may not be taking any action on attendance boundaries, then you may analyze it in context and say, move forward on this piece,
Hold on
hold
to
on
this.
that piece, which is fine. You can make that decision then.
Okay. Very good.
Excellent.
Policy 880?
880, we had one, I stole John's language. June had brought it up around the firefighters, just sunsetting that policy. They weren't specifically named. We talked about firefighters having volunteer, commingled village, city, municipal, all different. So we used the language first responders, emergency personnel. I've got that labeled there. And if you're okay with that, I'll bring that right back. It's not substantial, just honoring those pieces. I'd keep that on track.
Any questions or objections to that? Seems pretty straightforward. All right, I think we're good on that one.
Perfect.
And 887, relations with tax incremental finance
Yep,
review.
just to update you. So this was the one that we sent back and went, okay, do some research on this. What do people have? Are there model policies? What do other organizations who sit at these tables do or not do? And actually, Marine Park is doing a review right now. So they were gonna get their hands on kind of where they're landing, what sample language they might have, and share it with us. So I wouldn't anticipate this one coming forward on the 29th, but I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna get some other, maybe outside of our county too. Schools rarely have something on the books for this, and then when I was asking about process, so how do you know to go in and say what you're gonna say at the table? Because you do have kind of a say at the table, right? You're talking about it then, and then how do you keep people in the know around, because we receive the annual updates, and we were talking about board updates, but we're just talking about trying to put something in policy around, so what is our process and our expectation?
Yeah, so just to put this in context for those maybe
Oh, sure,
Watching
new to
at
the
home.
conversation.
right, that maybe you can talk about, it's almost how a bill becomes a law, how a TIF comes around, but also how the district can or does participate in that process.
Sure, so, so they're often called TIDs or TIFs, tax incremental district, or tax incremental finance, and a municipality may kind of draw a net around an area of land that would be developed. So, and they may give incentives in holding that land at a certain tax rate, and not counting those improvements till the project's done in totality. So you'll see this if you're bringing a new business in and it's bringing so many workers with it, or, you know, big housing developments, or new resources for a community, or there's been a blighted area and the city can't possibly do it on its own without maybe some partners and giving some kind of tax support to get that done. So there's a lot of great reasons for them to exist, but all the taxing authorities come to the table to talk about those projects, the why behind it, and do that. So that would be ourselves. Marine Park is a taxing entity, as another educational institution, and then we come to the table, and then we're really lending our voices and sharing questions, concerns, comments, things like that. But you are expected, when the development phase, you're giving a yes or no on that, and that was where so I've sat at the table, it's either myself or Andy Sarnow who sits at the table to represent the district. And then I usually consult with board president around this one's coming up, here's this, it's in alignment with. And again, my story prior was in a different district, having to go to a table and say no, and having had that conversation. with the board to know how to represent the district. I have not run into that here, but we do want to expand this language maybe a little bit to talk about that, so that whoever your representative is, that they know that they have to consult, they have to do those things, because they're sitting there representing the district. And then we talked about kind of that report to the board when we get that update on those TIDs or checks, how they're performing, how we make sure and turn that to our board. Certainly for the public, they would get that firsthand from the community. So West Bend is doing public meetings on that, providing that information. They hold that, we're just sitting at the table at that time. But we had talked about wanting to kind of wrap our heads around, how do we make sure that the process that we have set up kind of outlives us with that, again, that representation of the district.
Yeah, so it's really a process around disclosure of it happening, authority levels, and maybe guiding principles, that's what we're shooting for.
Yeah, so it's pretty, yeah, we might have to be some front runners in this part of the field, because public school wise, not many people had something or dictated, and then, like I said, as I got in question, so how do you know, and who do you consult with, and who do you ask, and it's like, oh, well, we just
do it.
You just kind of do that. Here's what I do or don't do. So it seemed really unique to maybe the individual leaders and things like that. So
To show how somewhat cutting edge this is, I'm guessing WASB did not have standard template language on this.
there is no policy template. There is no. So we talked about taking this through kind of area organizations, even others who would have a seat at the table, not just the K-12 district. So hence Marine Park, and then kind of larger organizations around what that could look like. So that's where we are on that. I would urge you to kind of, as we think about it, keep those questions coming. I don't anticipate they're gonna have something legally kind of mocked up, or we'll have all of that ready by our next meeting, the 29th. I think this one, we might wanna just be really thoughtful and hold over to our next meeting on that. But I wanted to talk that through around where we were and
Yeah, I don't think there's any urgency on that issue coming up.
No, I think we'd rather have
no.
quality over speed on this one.
Yeah, and our expectation, like I said, the expectation I hold for myself is to work in consultation. And then the board president and I, if something were to come up that were a question, we'd be bringing that to the full board. So we do hold that expectation for ourselves, but we'd like to get it in some language that makes sense for us.
Any other questions then on policy 887? Okay, hearing none, let's move to policy 980, retirement of facilities.
So this was go and do some fact finding. And do any of our buildings hold any special designations, historical pieces, all of that? And what's amazing, especially I think we were all thinking Jackson, we've talked about a new Jackson school and that end of the building being, is it historically designated? Is it this? Is it that? Guess what? We have one building that has historical designation. You're sitting in it. This building, because of its connection to the Amby properties, and that's why. So even their photos, their registry, all of that, all their photos are from kind of the tunnel over, not so much about our part, but it is technically on that designation. We were untangling, I still don't have the answer if it's federal or state recognition, but even they're saying, Corey from Buildings and Grounds, he was doing the legwork on that. He's like, oh, when I was calling, they're like, yeah, we don't really care about that part. It's really that part of it, but because they're physically connected. So we were looking at that and what the implications may or may not be in, as we look at policy language.
I was going to say that, so it sounds like we're still asking some questions on that, because I'm not, admittedly not super familiar with, there are various levels of historical designation, and whether or not what you've talked about, that designation is impactful or makes a difference or has a consequence, I don't know. So it sounds like
Well,
we'll see. But
and I've been really publicly transparent around, as we right size, one of the first assets I'd look to make a recommendation for removal is this one. We're sitting with property on Main Street. It's not a school, it's not gonna connect to kids. Our operations, when we have space in other places, we can go somewhere else. There's nothing in the designation that would hurt us from removing ourselves from this property in any way, shape, or form. So So that was one of those pieces. So as we just look at,
Does the district own this building or lease it?
we own it.
Okay.
Yeah, we own all of our properties.
So you own to the town?
Hmm?
You own to the town?
Yeah, I own all the way up to that tunnel.
Got it.
I did ask when I interviewed, I'm like, do I get an apartment with that? Like, I can just live on campus. So we were just looking, and then we had some other questions, so, we don't have that designation, I'll have legal look at it, just knowing that we're looking at, kind of letting go of some assets, most likely in theirs. What might they see that we're missing in this, to see if they've got any recommendations for enhancements, but those were our immediate questions as we
There was
looked
a
at it.
question about land use also.
For some of our properties.
Yes.
Yep. So we have some of that, so it depends on, I'll bring that forward with some of our recommendations that will come with our facilities in November around how our existing buildings are used, not used, and what we would recommend with the efficiency. So again, right sizing's coming. We will kind of take each one offline, and then what are the pros and cons of those being the ones taken offline, versus I think maybe prior approach, or what people are afraid of is like someone's actually gonna just shine a light on one campus and only look at that, and we made a commitment, we'll look at all of them offline and what the pros and cons are.
Great. Any questions then on policy 980, retirement of facilities? No? Okay, I don't hear any. So before we adjourn, we do have another meeting scheduled for 1 week from today, I believe.
Correct,
Here,
on the
same
29th.
time? Exactly.
So we'll grab that, like I said, knowing that cycle, all those annual notices, all those pieces, I'll bring forward kind of the last of those buckets, and I'll have that timeline for all the remaining, and then that consistent cycle of review. So I would think that we'll still have to run a couple in short order for those first leading months, because we've got all that work around instructional resource selection that we want to be in attention to, and then I'll get us on that cycle of every other as we do that. And then I'll bolster some meetings at that kind of annual notice time, at that, some of those peak times to review certain policies for us. And I'll put that on a calendar so everyone can look at it and kind of pull it apart. And then once we get through all those pieces, we're still working with board docs on some of the nuances in their portal. So recall, we're maintaining both platforms. So we're scanning and putting right on our website, but there's a portal behind the scenes in board docs where you can use policies. But there's weird little things around margins, font, all of that, getting it to be the way we really want it to before we totally let go and turn it over, so.
Great.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments before we adjourn? All right, I don't hear any. All right, therefore, unless there's an objection, any objections to adjourning? Hearing none, I believe we've adjourned by consensus. Thank you. See you at the next meeting.
Thank you. Mr. Donaldson, are you going to do our cameras for us?
That's right, that's right.
Thank you.
Zoned out.
We said he screams a little